All right, hey Gavin, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I guess to begin with, shall we just start with what's taking you on your journey into philosophy? Maybe go into where you are now, how your journey's been, and where you want to go in the future with it as well.
Right now I'm a freshman at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. My specialty, if you can call it such a thing, would be like postmodern thinkers, critical theory, and post-colonial studies. And I really didn't get into philosophy until later in high school. I had a bit of an incident in which um, on social media, someone had complained about the dress code at our school, that the administrators cared more about making women insecure about themselves than it did about actually protecting them, that it was kind of an overly stringent policy. And I reacted in just a really harsh, irresponsible way. And I got a lot of blowback throughout my school. And it just really changed the way that I viewed interacting with people socially, and it got me interested in like the importance of words and things like that. So I started just reading little bits of philosophy. I read Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, and I thought Boethius is like in prison and he's having a conversation with Lady Philosophy about like reconciling with death. And I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting. And then I started reading Nietzsche and all these other thinkers, getting into philosophy of religion and stuff like that. And I was like, okay, I think I like this. So now my track is just to hopefully become a professor one day.
Nice. So, when you say you had a blowback, um, would you say that was like, I guess, how old were you when you had the blowback when you on social media?
I was maybe 16.
Oh, okay. So yeah, relatively young. Well, that's like I would say it's a traumatic experience in the sense that not many people go through a trauma of that type. They sort
Yeah.
of get put out into the open world. And as you progress through, I guess through your 20s, you make a lot of sort of mistakes socially. And then through your 30s, you sort of adapt and then you figure out who you are. But having a traumatic experience at such an early age kind of puts you on a front foot in a respect that you've you went up a few like tiers straight away and thought, oh my God, this has altered my thinking at 16. That's an amazing thing to do. What sort of with the people around you when you sort of developed into going down philosophy, what sort of reception did you get from people around you?
Um, well, my journey into philosophy very seriously when it started to impact me really closely. I mean, like with the social blowback that I had gotten from my peers around me, um, it had kind of heightened my awareness to be careful about my words, but it didn't really impact me very closely until I had grown up in a predominantly Christian environment. And then I had decided that I was no longer a Christian. And that coincided with, okay, I need to be able to like have some ammo behind me to explain why I think the way I do. And as such, a lot of people were not very receptive to, I mean, the importance of philosophy. There's kind of, I mean, it's partly valid, but there's kind of this conception of philosophy as this wishy-washy semantics, concerned with inconsequential things. And most of my family was like, "Oh, this is taking you down the devil's path. This is your way of getting stuck in things that aren't important when your salvation is right here of concern." But gradually over time, especially my parents became rather receptive to. I suddenly started getting into reading after not really liking reading for a long time, even though I was like always fine at it. I started getting into writing. I started getting into discussions with my parents that slowly started to like build our relationship, for example, and really strengthen it. So I think over time, as people saw that it was something genuine. It was something that I was concerned about having honest conversations with people. I think it's hard to like not like someone who is trying to, create that kind of an environment.
Yeah. So you mentioned you were brought up in a Christian household, Christian background, and you made the decision that you're no longer Christian. From a from the point of view now, do you see any benefits of Christianity or religion from a philosophical point of view?
Yeah. I mean, one of my favorite philosophers that really helped me understand religion was Ludwig Feuerbach. He was kind of the one of the predecessors to Karl Marx, and he has this kind of naturalistic understanding of religion, not as a like a blight on humanity. And there's like a common understanding that Marx thought that same thing because Marx famously said that religion is the opiate of the masses. But people tend to forget the quote that comes after that, that it's the sigh of the oppressed, that it's some sort of way to cope with reality, way to create community, way to uh, get people to understand each other better by, I mean, it's hard to get people to sit down and read a book together, except maybe Bible studies and stuff like that. Like I see this guy every day when I walk to breakfast, sat outside reading his Bible, just like in the sunlight. And I'm like, why can I be mad at that? This dude's just enjoying a book and like having a good time. So it helps people at least think about things that they might not normally think about. So really, it is the sigh of the soul that needs to understand things. So I guess for the same reason that I enjoy philosophy, I can't really harp on religion as a whole, even if everyone knows that there are certain parts of it that can be detrimental.
Mm. Yeah, I sort of see as I've progressed through whatever journey I'm on at the moment, I've seen, well, I've had ups and downs with religion, and I guess I've come out of it probably more confused than before, in the sense that I have way more questions. But what I found is, as I've progressed through the journey of life, and I have been questioning things more and more, I see religion as more guidance for people who may not be able to cope with handling loads of questions that they have in their life. So then they have the guidance to say, all your answers are in this book. Here you go. Go and have purpose to your life.
But then on the other side of the coin, you can see how religion has been manipulated for to control the masses and to be used as a means for the people in power to just manipulate the masses and keep them on one avenue and not sort of think outside the box. And that's like sort of because for years, I think Cam's the same. We both probably saw ourselves as atheists, and it's only recently I've actually sat back and thought about it. How can I say God doesn't exist when nobody knows if God exists? And there's no definite proof out there whether God exists or not. So that's like sort of opened my mind up to actually God could exist, but not in the way organized religion says God exists.
Hmm. What's your thoughts around talking about God? And the more I look into the advancements of technology, I sort of see how God could be AI, for example. That's definitely a route. What do you, I guess, from a philosophical standpoint as well, how do you see philosophy being impacted by technology and more specifically artificial intelligence?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think especially when it comes to creationism kind of continuing to be popular, it has reacted to a lot of scientific advancements of like the Human Genome Project, for example, or understandings of like meteorology or evolutionary biology and kind of taking different parts of these and doing kind of what you said with the eye of this extreme complexity, this dumbfoundedness we have with the universe needs some sort of explanation. And I think, of course, it's a very natural response to be in awe of the universe. I think to some extent that's a healthy response to something that, as you said, Aaron, I mean, there's so much that we don't know. There's so many, I mean, we claim to have proofs for a lot of things that we really don't. Um, so I think in terms of that, I mean, technology has helped us open our minds to the fact that we don't understand a lot. And I think that's been something that I didn't realize was a very prominent theme in philosophy is, people tend to think philosophia, love of wisdom, the Greek, that it's just obsessed with gaining as much knowledge as possible. It's just kind of like amassing more and more information. But I think that's a really misguided way to think about what it means to be wise or to know things or to be a good human being. Is like plenty of philosophers are much more concerned about the things that we don't know and trying to keep an open mind in those circumstances, which, I mean, that's why I think philosophy is so great, because it takes, for example, in religion, you give people a holy book and here's everything you need. And philosophy is like, here's everything we don't yet know what we need, and let's just have fun in that area.
Yeah, it's like it's a bit open-ended, but it opening the doors to philosophy means you will have more discussions, and what I was having this conversation with someone the other day about when you look at conspiracy theorists, for example, they're just shunned down straight away to say they're batshit crazy. They're on about all this crazy stuff. Let's just not speak to them or even engage with conversation with them. But these people need to have conversation with people to actually determine where their viewpoint is. They might come out with a theory, and it's the same if you was to open a business, for example. You have a business idea. You don't just go ahead and just open the business and there you go. Hopefully, it makes some money. You want to have conversations with people to determine what you're doing is right or if it's wrong, or someone to play devil's advocate on the other side, or someone to agree with certain points but question you. And then you come down with an actual theory that makes more sense. I see philosophy being a door that opens conversation to help people sort of cement their thought processes. So I see it in a very positive light in that manner. Um, one other thing with sort of, I would say, like the challenges with free speech, which we see at the moment. Do you see that impacting philosophy in any major way?
Yeah, I mean, especially talking to my professors about like academic freedom and like, we know more and more every day the importance of language, whether it's, I don't know, whether it's the prominence of the phrase anti-Semitism when talking about the Israel-Palestine conflict. Like, whether it's a buzzword, whether it's a legitimate word in whatever context, language matters a lot. And I mean, is it a war? Is it a conflict? Is it a disagreement? All of this stuff. Language is really important. And I think traditionally academia has flourished on the idea of transgressing the common uses of languages, the accepted usage of languages. I mean, I have recently stumbled upon the Marquis de Sade, who's a very transgressive novelist. Just he thrives on embodying in his novels crazy sexual exploits, all this crazy stuff. And it's a whole genre to thought itself, the idea of transgression. And I think academia especially struggles with, you need to be pushing the boundaries. I mean, that's what you're paid to do, is to teach, to learn with people, which means to develop ideas. But then you also have the fact that universities are businesses. They thrive on maintaining a certain amount of status quo. And that really problematizes the idea of what it means to speak freely, because I mean that's never really been a closed concept. It always depends on, well, we know that incitements to violence aren't considered free speech, for example. But what is an incitement to violence? Is stochastic terrorism a form of free speech, or is it not? There's no absolute answer to that. But of course, the fact that universities today, where philosophy thrives, or at least is supposed to thrive, is more and more a business, it becomes increasingly challenging to talk about an objective notion of free speech, and it kind of just becomes marred with, oh, well, what do the benefactors of the universities consider free speech, for example?
So have you had that discussion with your professors? And what
Oh,
was their
yeah.
response? What was their response to that?
Just that they feel very nervous about talking about certain topics, and the fact that that's not something you should have to do at a university, because the point of going to a university is talking with points of view that you would never experience in your normal life. I mean, I know a lot of very sheltered people who are finally coming to university and are just learning about stuff that is just, it's a not appalling, it's just confusing that it's the first time they've heard about, maybe it's some strange fact in popular culture, or maybe it's some sort of idea, just stuff that was so obvious to me. So universities are created to help those kind of people learn to interact with other kinds of people. And that means getting comfortable with ideas that you don't want to be comfortable with, whether it's anti-vaxxers or whether it's, I just met someone who's a Holocaust denier. Like, never thought that I would get to go through my life learning that those kind of people like actually exist. I also met a flat earther, which is something that I thought I wouldn't ever have to experience. But, considering that all of those people are coming together, I see it as a potential for just this academic fruition of, we have so many ideas interacting with each other, and we have the flow of information with like the internet that we've never had the ability to have. But now it's so easy for students, for example, to go over the heads of their professors and just go straight to the higher ups and say, I didn't like this, have this person fired.
Hmm. Yeah, because it seems as if whatever rules and regulations were put in place sort of way back when were for sort of the safety of the students in a way. But that safety bracket has kind of been expanded so wide that even a slight question which could hurt someone's feelings um, becomes something that falls in the bracket of a matter of safety. I don't know if you saw when I forgot his name now, Matt something did the What is a Woman
Matt
documentary.
Walsh.
Matt Walsh, yeah, that's it. There was a lot of academic outrage, let's call it, just because he was asking a simple question, but that shouldn't be. He's not making a statement. He's not throwing an insult. He was literally asking a question, which caused outrage because that's a topic that shouldn't be discussed and it needs to be suppressed. And we need to. I don't know. I don't really understand where we want to go with it, but I see that as one of the biggest problems with philosophy is if you can't ask in academia is if you can't ask the questions how are we going to progress? Like we're going to have to, and that's why I asked about AI because then I think, well, we're just going to have to rely on AI to give us the answers, which is programmed by the same institutions that don't want the question to be asked in the first place.
Oh yeah. I mean, like, to me, AI is kind of on the precipice of us understanding the tremendous faults in a lot of the presuppositions we hold in academia, in conversations with one another. For example, the philosophy club here at my school, we had a presentation on the ethics of space travel and whether or not we are permitted to colonize other planets, to terraform other planets, whatever it may be. And one of the presuppositions we didn't really think about until the very end was we are presupposing a sort of right to proliferate, to optimize the human species, to increase lifespans, to increase flourishing. But, of course, this has a ceiling, like we have a biological ceiling, so to speak, that we're trying to alter and whatnot. And considering that in the AI discussion, I mean, the fact that it's programmed, like you said, by people, it's going to be laden with those people's presuppositions about what does it mean to be logical or rational. Like those aren't innocent terms, as much as it may seem to be an innocent term. I mean, rationality was one of the backbones of colonialist projects of, oh, these people aren't rational, or Arabs don't have the rational capacity to rule themselves, and thus we will colonize them. So, I mean, I think part of the thing that makes AI so appealing, this like straightforward rationality of you give me a question and I give you an answer, it is just laden with so many problems that I see in our history.
And they're problems that we'll only find out 50 to 100 years later down the line, that we've been implementing these things using AI, and now all the problems are arising now. And shit, what should we do?
Mm. Well, and I'm always so careful because, Cam, you were talking about conspiracy theories, and there's always a part of every person that is a little bit conspiratorial. You're trying to go below the belt a little bit and try to figure out stuff that's not apparent. So there's always that part of me that's like, oh, there's a huge conspiracy with AI, and how's it going to turn into some sort of apocalyptic movie? And then I'm always careful to fetter myself and be like, we're really bad at telling the future. Like humans are terrible at that. So I always try to just be like, you know what, I'm gonna act in the here and now, and I'm not gonna like speculate about some like Terminator takeover or something. But like we have no idea what's gonna happen.
Well, I guess a lot of that with the conspiracy theory side is we, as humans, love fantasy. So when you try and paint this vivid picture of a dystopian future, it is exciting to think about, oh my God, I could live through that, something that's never happened before. It kind of gets the fantasy part of you, the imaginative part of your brain going. So I guess it just draws into the dopamine, I guess, in a weird way.
Yeah, and I mean that idea of fantasy, like that is the backbone of this notion of space travel, of this fantasy to open up into the universe and have ourselves recognized, to find other life, to have some sort of recourse, some recognition from some other form of life or something. I mean, that's one of Nietzsche's backbones in understanding religion, for example, is for Nietzsche, just like Marx, it's a sort of opiate of the masses, a sort of way to tarry with one's position by saying, okay, I'm experiencing struggles right now, but you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to make this position of struggle into something that is eternal in the form of like original sin. Like I was destined for this, and then I have a hope up here that transcends me that I can rely on. So for Nietzsche, religion is just, I mean, it might sound like a little bit of an atheist stereotype to say religion is a fantasy, but that doesn't necessarily make it bad. There's all kinds of fantasies that we rely on to interact with the world. But nevertheless, it brings into view that when we talk about fantasy, to me, what's less important is the object of the fantasy than the reason we need the fantasy in the first place. The sort of, what are we tarrying with right now that Nietzsche says we're trying to escape to get to like God or even the state, for example.
Hmm. So why do you think? Uh, I know obviously social media played a massive part in it, but why do you think there's in the West there's such a massive sort of rise in nihilism, and so many people feel like I guess they're not even looking. I guess you can look at it from one side that video games is a fantasy where people log on, escape the world for a bit, and get that fulfillment of escapism. But why do you think there's such a rise in nihilism across the West right now? And I guess I'll ask you this after it, but what's the best way do you think to combat nihilism as a
Hmm.
human?
Yeah, I mean, I think like the idea of the meaning crisis, for example, is a very popular idea. And it had traditionally been formulated kind of the way Marx formulated alienation, that in capitalism we are alienated from our labor because the fruits of our labor, we don't experience them. We just get a wage, and the capitalist gets to deal with the fruits of our labor and get all the credit and all the profit and whatnot. And laden behind that notion of alienation is the idea of a true self, of something you need to get back to that's been covered up by all these layers. And I think that that idea of a true self, at least in part, is an ideological myth. It's something that we're told in order to get along with each other. For example, in social contract theory, the idea that we give up some of our rights to harm one another in order to enter into a social contract with one another so that we can get along, so we can create society, so we don't die in like a state of nature. There's this sort of presupposed idea of the self as this rational thing that wants to interact with one another, that wants just pure harmony. And there are problems with that notion of selfhood that I think is the reason nihilism is becoming so popular, is people are learning of the reality of, for example, their very limited political power. The election is coming up here in the States, and everyone's talking again about the Electoral College or about the state of voting here in the US. And this happens for every election cycle for every country, I would imagine. And people are realizing more and more that like lobbying organizations are the ones that are deciding a lot of, policies, and politicians that get into office, for example. So we've been sold for a very long time this idea of the rational self that is represented, that is understood by the state and things like that. And we're kind of getting into this moment where, with all the information of like the internet, for example, we get to a point where we realize our profound impotence and the sort of, the strength of a message of you're represented, the like Uncle Sam, I want you, like I recognize you. It's like, do you really recognize me? And then when that fantasy goes away and we realize the profound non-recognition of each other, that, I mean, for example, we can talk face to face, but we're also not face to face. There's like a very faux kind of recognition going on there, that I think that kind of really helps contextualize why nihilism would be so popular.
And how would you say, if you was to give advice to, I guess, the mass population who are experiencing nihilism right now, how would you say the best way to combat such a thing would be?
Hmm. One of my first essays I ever wrote was on the myth of an absolute meaning. This idea that there is a meaning of your life that's been set out in advance, that you have to aspire to. And I think tarrying with something like that, realizing that, you know, there is nothing but the here and now, so to speak. And there's a past that has happened, and there's a future that has not happened. And there's a lot of things that are going to decide what that future is. But there is certainly activity that can be done now in order to affect that future in a way that you're not beholden to some meaning that was set out in advance. And for a lot of people, that might initially make them even more nihilistic of, you're saying life has no purpose? You're saying I have no reason to be here? I might as well just kill myself? Like, no, like pump the brakes a little bit, because we've been sold this idea of the self with an absolute meaning, with an absolute purpose in society that you've had from birth, that you've engaged in the social contract since your birth. Because we're slowly coming out of that and realizing kind of the fact that, especially with the internet, you're just one individual among many. You're just a person sitting here doing things, trying to tarry with reality. And as such, when people learn to create their own meaning, I mean, one of my favorite parts of Nietzsche's philosophy, and a lot of religious folks are like, you just want man to be God now? You just want there to be just the floodgates are open. It's just up to us now. It's like, yeah, it's up to us to make a flourishing society, to figure out how to get along with each other, to figure out how to, I mean, get over our differences, or we will suffer like we will with all sorts of potentially cataclysmic futures. But it's up to us. And that should be something that excites us. Like, I think that's my favorite thing about Nietzsche is even people who have just barely heard of Nietzsche know that he's a nihilist. But they don't go into the nuance of how does Nietzsche respond to that nihilism? And it's with song and dance and poetry and happiness. One of his most famous works, Die fröhliche Wissenschaft, the joyous science or the gay science. Everyone assumes that that's like a piece of gender theory, but it's not. Like, that is the future of nihilism, is realizing how to be joyful, and not in like an unabashedly just idealistic way of, oh, this is just the best world to be in. This is just great. Like, no, slavery is still a thing. Conflicts and genocides are still occurring. People are still suffering. It doesn't mean the world is great, but it does mean we have the potential to make it better, and that should excite us.
Yeah, I completely agree with you with that because it's the journey of yourself. If people are always relying on other people to help them through tragedy or help them through a tough situation, the more and more challenges that you face moving forward, and maybe one of them times you don't have someone that's going to help you, you're going to crumble like straight down. You're going to fall hard. So if you look at this is the way I sort of live my life is any small challenge or any small problem that I've got, like try and take joy out of solving it. Like enjoy the process of solving that problem. Because one day when there's something massive that comes your way, you've built up enough resilience to think, wow, that's a big problem. Like let's dive straight in and figure this puzzle out and look at all of life problems as a puzzle that need a solution providing for them.
Mm. Yeah, and that's one of my favorite aspects of a notoriously difficult philosopher, Gilles Deleuze. He's a French guy that everyone seems to hate because his philosophy is very complicated and very wordy, and everyone thinks he doesn't understand a lot of things. But one of my favorite points of his is recontextualizing philosophy as not a love of wisdom in the sense of gathering information, but a love of wisdom as in the creation of wisdom in response to problems. That philosophy, that life in general, about being a good thinker, is about finding a problem, isolating a problem, and figuring out how to find a solution, knowing that that solution is not just going to eliminate the problem, like that problem helps structure our lives. Maybe it is like finding yourself. Like, obviously, that's not a process that you ever stop until you die. You're constantly trying to find a self, and you don't ever really complete that. But if we're going to take like a Nietzschean lens on this, why would that make us unhappy? That seems like that gives us instead the potential to grow, to learn, to constantly respond to problems instead of just becoming conceited and saying, none of it matters anyways.
Yeah. I guess that's sort of like driving a car and stop putting fuel into it. You're just going to stop and not move, and you're going to be in a really dull situation. But if you look at all of what you've listed there as fuel for your vehicle to keep moving, you're just going to keep going and going, and you're going to be on an adventure. I guess life is an adventure in that sense. One question I had jotted down was, what would you say if for someone that's wanting to get into philosophy, maybe they're in school, what would you say the biggest challenges of entering philosophy are?
I would say the biggest problem is all the isms, Marxism, atheism, all the isms, especially the modern thinkers, especially the modern French thinkers, love to give you all these isms, all of these world events, and they won't cite them, by the way. They'll just assume that you know them. And that's just annoying to read. I mean, it's interesting to like learn about new events, learn about new ideologies, but it is so difficult as a beginner to, I mean, you hear about people like Nietzsche, but you need so much background to understand someone like Nietzsche because, they're standing on the shoulders of giants, just like the people before them. So I think the problem that everyone sees, whether they're trying to get into literature, whether they're trying to get into dance, whether they're trying to get into philosophy, is all of the new stuff is really hard, but all of the new stuff is the most interesting stuff that matters the most for what you're doing. So, like, I have read very little Plato or Aristotle, but, Plato and Aristotle are supposed to be the backbone of Western philosophy. So there's a constant balancing game of, well, I need to know this background knowledge, but the new stuff is the stuff that's the most cool. And you kind of have to have a dialectic here where you go back and forth and you say, okay, I need a little bit of background, then I can get to these new guys. So everyone is going to experience that boredom of reading Marcus Aurelius. I really don't find him particularly exciting. I mean, he's one of these great Stoic thinkers. He's an emperor and he can do whatever he wants, but he chooses virtue and stoicism instead. And it's like some people love him. I just don't find him that compelling among many other ancient, and like kind of earlier philosophers. But that's just kind of what you have to do. So it's a matter of finding the current problems that interest you the most and using that as a barometer for, okay, what do I need to go back and pull from in order to understand the current stuff?
Right. Yeah. I've seen that with a few things in life, I guess in general, is interested in something current, and then well, I guess it's like going down a rabbit hole of like trickling down in time, and then you end up at sort of one of, or if not the source of the issue, and then you're just like you're amazed by the journey this issue's gone on to, and then it sort of helps you predict or look at what could be in the future, and then I guess then you go down that fantasy because there's many different avenues for the future.
Yeah, I mean, that's the best thing about being a good thinker is you have a really niche rabbit hole. Like I was just watching um, a news article or a news video today, and there was an academic who specialized in gun culture in the US. Such a niche topic. Like he has all these magazines about like, oh, how have guns been sold to the American public throughout the years? How has the Second Amendment been viewed? All this different stuff. Like very niche topics, but like undeniably important with, for example, like the US has a lot of school shootings, like the big problem. So all these niches are meant to solve current problems, but like all of the best thinkers just have these little tiny things that they're interested in. One of my professors likes um, Roman property law, which just seems super niche to me.
What's what, what's your niche? Have you found your niche and what you're most interested in?
Yeah, I would say my niche is probably anti-colonial violence in the Middle East.
So, with you looking into the Middle East, I guess like global to a certain extent, what would you how was best to phrase this question? So, from a philosophical point of view, would you agree or disagree or both with globalism being a good thing or a bad thing?
I'm always so conflicted on this because I think there's a lot of ideas about what globalism means. If by globalism is meant one world government in which everyone is subsumed under this hierarchy, I think that's totalitarian in nature. I think that's very problematic. And it also depends on a sort of false stability of humans and the state. Like, whether it's like a low-level organization of like a soup kitchen, for example, it depends on the stability of people to follow a schedule, which humans are not always good at following a schedule. And, as you get higher and higher, as you build up more and more bureaucracy, it requires more and more stability that's even less and less tenable. So I think considering all the differences between people, I mean, there are profound cultural differences between, for example, Western Europe and the US and the Middle East. And that's not to attach a value judgment to it. That's just to state a fact that there are lots of cultural differences. And how we respond to that, I mean, it's undeniable that already globalism exists to an extent in the sense of global markets, for example. I mean, you can have certain key choke points in shipping routes where if one of those gets cut off, the whole like oil just shoots up or oil plummets. Like globalism already happens to an extent, and it's just a question of, well, if we go completely laissez-faire and we just let people do whatever we want, then you get monopolies and you get one or two, three corporations that own everything. That already kind of happens with media, for example, of like media monopolies where five companies own 99% of all the media coverage in a country. Like that has the potential to be a problem, but I think with fettered regulations, it doesn't exactly seem untenable in the same way that like free speech with fettered regulations seems tenable.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Um, what have you done much sort of research into and around China and sort of well, I guess what's your thoughts on China as a culture, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much fear culture, especially here in the US, who views itself as the number one world superpower and China as its existential enemy. Like, there's a lot of fear mongering where most of the people I've ever talked to about China know absolutely nothing about it. And it's undeniable that it's authoritarian. Like, it's undeniable that its governmental structure is not the optimal structure for human flourishing. And there are ways that we can respond to that in a number of ways. That's problematized by the fact that much of the world relies on China's exports. So I think that's where globalism has the potential to be good, because countries that fundamentally disagree with each other's like almost very existence are forced to interact with each other, are forced to be beholden to each other. So I think that it's important to understand, like, for example, the history of why China exists, particularly the Chinese Communist Party, um, why it doesn't like the US so much, considering a lot of US imperial responses in Eastern Asia. So I think like when we start to understand things like colonialism, we start to better understand kind of the reasons why the conflicts exist. And I think it at least makes it a little bit easier to understand a possible future because like I imagine if both sides of the debate were extremely informed and maybe even to the point of empathy with each other's goals, it would be a lot easier to talk about a future where we're not just worried about scapegoating and whatnot, and we're worried about actual human flourishing. But whether that's a possibility or not is very
Yeah,
high.
no, it's very true. With China, like, yeah, when you've just said you've got two countries that basically despise each other, but yet they've got agreements, trade agreements for profit for both countries, which sort of keeps them friendly with each other. That's why globalism can be like reduce unnecessary conflict because it's like, well, you guys are both sorted out a good deal. Just you don't need to get along. You just need to keep operating the way you're operating.
Mm. Yeah, and then there's of course the flip side of this where globalism is really good at integrating the world. But what happens for people who don't want to integrate, who want to maintain their own sphere of influence, who want to maintain their own regional dominance, and especially when you have, for example, kind of cultural stereotypes, like I had said about Arabs, for example, it's very easy to look at that entire part of the world and say that their job is to be subservient to the West, whatever that term may mean. So it's very difficult to play a balancing game where we can have like a robust definition of what it means to be a global world, but also a way in which people can have individuality. I mean, where countries can have individuality just like people can.
Yeah. Yeah, because when you look at the way the sort of like the EU has gone, it seems like that is just in a I don't know how many years, but in a few years' time, 10, 20 years, whatever, that could quite easily just become one thing, and all of them cultures will just combine into one, and that will be it. And then a lot of it will go forgotten about.
You also see it a lot with immigration. So in the UK, we've got a lot of immigration here, and you're hearing a lot of talk about how the British culture's sort of being affected by it. Like the British culture's starting to be cancelled out, and it's just becoming about all these like micro cultures that have come over and settled here. And you can see how the British people are getting pissed off with it because their home country has sort of been changed and moved into something that they don't want anymore, or they don't want, and they want to keep it sort of. Their like traditional pubs and traditional restaurants are being replaced with like I don't know Turkish restaurants, and it's good in a way because you get to experience different cultures, but then you can see the flip side where that British heritage is starting to be wiped away. And I don't know if have you seen a similar thing in the US? Well, the US is sort of built on immigration anyway, isn't it?
Which is so weird considering our rhetoric here regarding immigration. Like, as you said, we are built on immigration. Like all the people that claim that America is theirs are from where y'all are.
Yeah.
So it's just it's so dumbfounding to me how historically ignorant a lot of takes are here in the US with regards to immigration, where immigrants are seen as posing some fundamental threat, where I think obviously immigration in excess is a problem for any country, any individual. I mean, again, to bring up my philosopher Deleuze that I brought up, he has some really interesting thoughts regarding we tend to think that stability is primary. Like when it comes to national identity, that the stability and the permanence of that identity is what makes it what it is. But Deleuze flips it on its head and says that actually the variation at the borders of what we consider our national identity, our place of comfortability, that's actually what defines it the most. That, for example, this is to me the most pertinent in the US. I was kind of raised understanding the US as the great melting pot, that it's all these different, oh, that it's all of these different cultures that come together and coexist in a melting pot together and get along. And to me, that's the epitome of the supposed fixity of a national culture, which is actually defined by variation, by all these changes that are coming together and making what we think to be stable is actually just one moment in time of this history of immigration, for example. So like, even when it comes to languages, for example, they're the same way. We tend to think that languages are something stable, something that have all these rules because they're supposed to be there. But we don't think about the fact that something that defines our, for example, our comfortability in the way we use our language is defined by someone over here pronounces something different than I do, or someone uses different terminology, or someone has kind of a patois version of the language that I speak. And that seems to equally define what a language means, what anything supposedly stable means, is the fact that there's some variation somewhere else that you kind of have to keep at an appropriate distance. So I think that notion of appropriate distance, of kind of controlling that flow, in a responsible manner, I think that's a great way to think about integrate or immigration.
So you said your niche is sort of the Middle East and anti-colonialism. Have you researched much on sort of Islamic philosophies?
Yeah. I always try to keep informed about those because, considering that I started with philosophy of religion, I only realized until later that I had only ever really been concerned with the philosophy of Christian religion, not with religion as such. And I mean, Aaron, like you talked about before, the kind of naive, like, God does not exist, period, is predicated upon this assumption that I know all the religions, when in fact there's all these religions, all this stuff that I don't know about, that we don't have a solid proof that every single possible concept of God couldn't exist. So I kind of got back into, okay, well, I need to read the Quran, or I need to learn something about this stuff that is so prominent here in the US with like 9/11. Like everyone wants to say something about Arabs without actually knowing anything about them. So I mean, I felt like it was my duty to learn something.
Mm. Yeah, when you say I'm obviously guilty of this as well because from like, living in England and going through the educational system, I wasn't brought up religious in any means, but going through the education system in England, you get taught a lot of Christianity. So when I got to sort of an age where I could question it a little bit more, I just automatically associated all the other religions as the same as Christianity, but adapted to their culture. And then as I got even older and a little bit more sort of wiser, I was like, started actually looking into just a little bit, not deep into them, just looking at the sort of main sort of story of each religion. I was like, oh, they are all just the same thing, just a different message. I guess Hinduism's different in a sense. And then I just sort of dismissed them all as, yeah, it's just the same thing, just a different country, different language, different culture. They've just retold the story in a different way. And I just dismissed them all where I probably shouldn't have.
Well, yeah, and it's so easy to totally ignore, once again, these presuppositions that are guiding our thinking of, for example, Western responses to the hijab. Everyone wants to claim that it's just a question of oppression and that's it. And that's not an empty argument or understanding of the hijab. Like in part, especially when it's imposed by law, like most things that are imposed by law of this nature are going to be oppressive in some manner. But of course, when we nuance this, for example, and I don't know, you read stuff in the Quran that talks about covering yourself or whatnot, and see the justifications of, oh, it's a question of modesty. And then you start to think about, well, what is the modesty culture here in the US or in the West? That very much exists. Like there are all sorts of movements of, oh, you need to be dressed virtuously or appropriately, or it's your fault if something happens to you. So like we're very familiar too with this notion of modesty. Just when it comes from another culture, we're so willing to just give a blanket statement and not nuance it at all.
Yeah. We saw that quite a lot when Qatar had the FIFA the World Cup, right? Is we everyone just from the West sort of looked at them as just wrong, just without even knowing anything about it, just the straight up first um, sort of thought that they had was it's just not right.
Yeah, and that's so weird because Qatar is like one of the most modernized countries in the Middle East. So it's like if you're gonna have this prejudice to literally anyone from the Middle East, even when if you look at pictures of Qatar, like they're one of the most advanced just looking civilizations in the world. It's like I don't know where the bar is if it's just anyone other than us.
Yeah. With so just as going way back to the beginning, but you was on about how you got brought up Christian and your family were, I guess, skeptical about you going into philosophy. Have you opened their minds more around religion and their beliefs just from the journey you've been on, and I guess the discussions you've had with them as well?
Yeah, I think especially um, I have a very, very conservative grandmother who I love very much. She's one of my closest friends. She introduced me to classical music, which is um, one of my favorite things in the world. But she had a lot of misconceptions about what it means to be anything other than Christian. There's a lot of, like, especially Romans 1 in the Bible paints a very nasty picture of non-believers, of them being apathetic, of them just being here to cause disaster and war and whatnot. And one of the most profound experiences that I had was growing in our relationship after I became an atheist, which required all kinds of, I mean, arguments, heated arguments sometimes, which is just going to happen no matter the good intentions of two interlocutors. But over time, just seeing the change in our interactions of, I mean, for example, it was constantly at random hours of the day, I'm praying for you, grandson. God's going to come back to you, or you're going to come back to God. Like that, that was very constant. And then over time, it happened a little less. But our relationship didn't get any less strong. There was just sort of a re-understanding of the goalposts of, okay, I'm starting to get comfortable with just understanding you as you actually are. And I think it only takes a couple of experiences like that in someone's life to kind of totally change the way that they interact with other people, of seeing someone who is just totally alien to you, that you can't even understand. And that was something that I didn't realize until later, is that she just doesn't understand what it's like to, not be a Christian. Just like I may not understand plenty of other things that are just right at home for me that I'm not willing to question. So I think seeing that interaction in particular really opened my eyes to just the nuance of honest conversation in general, just trying to get to know someone who's different.
Yeah, I can definitely understand that because just from doing this podcast in general, we've spoke to people who similar to what you were saying at the beginning, right? You've had conversations with flat earthers and people you never thought you would have conversations with because it was so far out to what your actual thinking was. But having these conversations with people, no matter how crazy some of the conversations have been, they've opened my mind and just made me realize the world does not revolve around me. There's so much more going on. And once that cap's open, like you can then just be open to pretty much any idea or any theory. And I guess I'm at a point now where I wouldn't say I genuinely believe this or I genuinely believe that. I think, oh, it's got legs, it's got good substance behind it, and it's interesting. But I guess the philosophical side is we may never we may never know the right answers.
Yeah, it's like when from doing this podcast, we've realised the more stuff we find out, the less stuff we know.
And that is, I don't know about y'all, but that's dually humbling and exciting for me. Like the fact of figuring out what I don't know, not to like pat myself on the back or anything. I think it would happen to anyone, but that's like a very mature way to think about thinking in general. And I think everyone can do that, can approach situations like we had said earlier, as something where you can enjoy the process of figuring out how to solve it, figuring out how to deal with it.
Yeah. So, what do you think about what do you make of the education system? Because I remember in school, you wasn't really allowed to. It wasn't really open for debate much. It was like the teacher's reading from a book, and whatever in that book he's reading is what's going to be on the test. So don't even ask any questions because well, whatever question you've got is probably not going to be on the test. And I didn't in school. I really didn't even think about it. I was like, all right, whatever. Let's just do whatever we need to do. And I was bored out of my mind through school. But it was only after school I was like, hold on a minute, that there was there was no room for like open discussion. And then it was only after school I got introduced into philosophy and that sort of thinking and asking questions. What do you make of the school system at the moment and the way it's going with really restrictive conversations?
Yeah, I mean, I think teachers to me have such an important role, like especially in like middle and high school, for example, when people are really developing their sense of individuality, they're going through all these changes in how they express themselves physically or like even online is a totally new way of thinking of how you express yourself. What do you look like on social media or whatnot? And in my middle and high school experience, just like you said, conversation was very limited. And I think that's one of the moments where conversation is very important. I had one teacher where we did a lot of seminars in my literature class. I love that. I mean, maybe it's just because I like to talk, but just having seminars where you read something and you talk about it with other people. Like we read a statement by Trump and a statement by Putin about the Russo-Ukrainian war. Like, not only is that very pertinent, but having an interaction with other students that isn't just on social media where everything can be so just thrown into the air, when it's in kind of a controlled environment where people are encouraged to be intellectually honest with each other, where they're encouraged to be kind to one another, to represent each other well, like that is the job of the education system and specifically of teachers. And like as I've gone into university, I've realized that like being a teacher is not just about stating your opinions and convincing people. Like, I mean, no one wants to be taught by that person because if you disagree with them, there's no learning that can happen between you. It's a matter of the teacher presenting ideas that they might fundamentally disagree with as if they agreed with them in order to present them in an honest way where you can have a conversation about them, where you can slowly guide the conversation of, well, hey, students, this is why I think social contract theory is a little bit problematic. Let's talk about it. Or, what are some of the issues with democracy? Like that's kind of a hot button issue, but that's something that Plato talked about in the Republic of some of the issues with democracy, of problems with just straight mob rule. So like being a teacher in an education system has so much potential, but I just wish I could see a lot more of it in like middle and high school education where that's so necessary.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree because from doing the podcast, when I have an idea, I'm never really fully set on my ideas. Like if I have an idea, I'll say it happily, knowing that within 5, 10 minutes of having a conversation, I could think the complete opposite just because I've had the dialogue with someone in the conversation. It's happened numerous times just from me and Aaron having conversations. I come out with an idea and we have a sort of like a thought experiment around it. And then we come out and I'm like, yeah, that's completely different to how I came into that conversation. But the amount of fulfillment and excitement you get out of coming out of there thinking, oh, I achieved something. It might have been the lousiest statement ever that got changed, but you come out of it thinking that the world's not one dimensional. You can go into things and things can change and you can adapt and you can grow. And yeah, I guess that then circles back to what we were talking about before about purpose and what actually is purpose. It is having something to something to do basically.
Yeah, do you think in society these days a lot of people are so latched onto their ideas that they're not willing to think about anything else and be open-minded because they get an idea and they just want to argue that idea all day long without listening to what other people's ideas are. And
Yeah, and I mean, like being open-minded is just as hard as being closed-minded because it's so easy to become so open-minded that your brain falls out, to just like to become infinitely receptive to anything that comes to you. And like this is a problem, especially with my generation, is my generation, I think, knows, just because we've grown up in it, the importance of language more than other generations. Not that like anyone has been less intrinsically capable of understanding it, but like just throughout my entire life, hearing like isms and all sorts of terms, blank phobia, like it's just rampant. And it's a way to understand each other, but it's so easy to like, especially with the topic of like gender identity, for example, like it's a very careful place to be in because learning about like gender studies or gender theory, for example, has really opened my eyes to kind of gender is one of the fundamental ways that we are taught how to exist in the world of, oh, you're a boy, you ought to like cars, or you want to wear pink, that's a little weird. And of course that changes over time, but like that's one of the things that you're just born into and comes along with certain ways of how you're going to live. And then as we start to question that, you realize that, okay, if you don't question enough, you risk certain people being oppressed, being underrepresented. You risk, very real like gender pay gap kind of stuff and whatnot. Like there are real things that accompany these differences. But then you risk going above and beyond and just opening your mind to the extent that anyone who has a new experience is infinitely valid in and of themselves. When if you have that response to everything, you run the risk of just not being a rigorous thinker, of understanding, well, here's a new ism I've never heard before. And you'll hear more and more isms every day. And you'll hear more and more, nuances on gender identity or pronoun usage, for example. Like pronoun usage is a great example of, okay, I want to be nice to you. I'll call you by what you want because I would want people to call me by what they want. But nevertheless, you're at this point where, we have societally acceptable ways of talking to people, and it takes a lot of effort to get outside of that. And when you have the expectation that everyone be infinitely open-minded, that they accept your pronouns, your gender identity, just as it is, like that gender identity doesn't exist in a vacuum, and it takes time, it takes understanding, it takes slowly changing your categories to a point where you can be open-minded enough where you can take something seriously. So I think we're all too willing to demonize people who aren't open-minded enough, whereas it's not that complicated. Everyone is closed-minded in some respects, and I think that's a good thing to an extent.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah. I guess so when you all these isms that come out, would you say that's a bad thing in the sense that as much as we are individual, we are also tribal species. And when you're coming out with all of these isms, it's just breaking down any tribe that comes across. Because if you get a tribe that's a certain ism, and then you break that down into seven more tribes, then them seven people are now in seven different tribes, and so on and so forth. Do you think having too many isms is a bad thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you think about society like a cell trying to keep itself alive, there's always new information, new material coming in and out, and it's trying to regulate itself. It's trying to keep that cell membrane intact, trying to keep itself going. So there's a good amount of like diffusion of new stuff that's kind of necessary. But you obviously can't take that to the extreme. And I think especially in human society, because we're tribal, like you said, it's so easy to take a term like Islamophobia and make it absolutely meaningless, such that you can't criticize Islam because everything is Islamophobic, for example. You know, we get to the point where isms don't become descriptive, but they become prescriptive of prescribing you things you can't talk about, things you can't do, places you can't go. And like, that's not the point of thinking, at least for me. I mean, the point is transgressing those boundaries in a healthy way where you can learn new things, where you can nuance points instead of using new terminology to the point where we just dilute anything of substance or nuance.
Mm. Yeah, because them isms then become a set of rules and regulations and a set of barriers to stop all sorts of behaviors from taking place. Hmm.
Yeah, and so me and Cam were half Indian, half English, and one thing that within like the past 5 years or so, one ism that I've got like a little bit annoyed with is racism, because sometimes I feel people say things are racist or like it's racism that isn't actually racist or racism, and then I think you're taking away like what genuine racism is. If I was to say, oh, I walked down the street and I was in the UK, we use the word "paki," and it means like it's like a racist slur to a South Asian person. So if someone called me a paki and beat me up, and I came back and said, "Oh, as a racist attack," a lot of people would be like, "Was it really racist?" Because blah 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 was said this was racist, and it wasn't really racist, was it? So it's kind of like diluting what the word actually means. So then when something bad does happen and it is a racist attack, that attack isn't seen as severe as it would have been 10 years ago.
And I think like to go back to the anti-Semitism term that I had used before, plenty of well-meaning people in this current Israel-Palestine conflict will use anti-Semitism in a way that not only dilutes its meaning and eliminates its meaning, but gets in the way of people actually being able to express their stories, their opinions, whatever it may be. And I think like with racism, for example, there's a fundamental distinction between racism and racial prejudice. Think of the difference between being self-centered and being selfish. Someone could do something for a self-centered reason. Like maybe I help an orphan because it gives me a sense of satisfaction to provide for humanity. You wouldn't necessarily call me selfish for that, even if I did it for a partially self-centered reason. You would just say, well, we're motivated to do things, at least in part, because of our own self-interest, because it feels good or whatnot. Whereas if someone does something because they're selfish, you're attaching a value judgment to that. You're saying that not only was it self-centered, but it is wrong for them to do it because they're self-centered. In the same way with racism, everyone has racial prejudices because, as you said, Cam, we're tribal. We are concerned with the well-being of those who are the most similar to us. And as such, racial prejudice is natural. Now, if you approach that in a responsible, nuanced manner, there's no problem. But then, of course, when it gets to racism, we're saying not only do you have prejudice, but you're doing something harmful with that prejudice. So when people want to point to anything that has any racial prejudice of any kind and extrapolate from that that it's racist, that it's therefore harmful, has the potential, like you said, Aaron, to get rid of, like, maybe someone gets beat up because of something genuinely racist, and people are like, well, is it actually racist? What is considered racist? It's become totally diluted by this need for an infinite amount of specificity that I don't think is actually that helpful to people who use the word racism in order to actually understand bad things that happen to other people.
Do you think the term sort of racism, anti-Semitism is used so much in mainstream media to sell headlines, to sell papers, to sell stories, to get people clicking on videos because they're quite strong words, aren't they? So if you see those words, you automatically get drawn to them. So you'll click on the video and see what was anti-Semitic or racist.
Yeah, I mean, the epitome of this sort of usage you speak of happened in the Barbie movie, where Barbie gets called a fascist. And it's just this sort of sensationalization of a term to the point where, I mean, it's comical in the movie. Everyone laughed in the theater when that happened because the term has no meaning at that point. It's been taken to an extreme where you clearly don't care about specificity, you care about profitability, about publicity. And like, I mean, media is always going to thrive off using those terms and sensationalizing them and just emptying them of all substance.
Yeah, it's like taking serious terms, serious things, I guess, and turning them into pop culture, making them trendy, making them cool. And if you're saying everyone was laughing in cinema, making them fun and exciting. It's and it really, really reduces the like what Aaron just said, like with anti-Semitism and racism, they are harsh words to use. But even me, like just talking about them now, it's completely diluted in my mind that they are as harsh as they actually are. You have to stop and think, what does that word actually mean? And then look at the situation and think, holy moly, like this is going out of control.
Yeah, especially at the moment, you could load up YouTube or Twitter or whatever you want, any social media at the moment. You scroll down a few pages, you're guaranteed to see anti-Semitic somewhere in the headline. Which, yeah, if you're seeing it every single day, it's sort of automatically your brain's just going to like just see it as normal.
Yeah, because like, I mean, like you said, Cam, we become kind of desensitized to the term to the extent where, okay, what really is the thrust behind the evil of anti-Semitism? The Holocaust. 6 million people died because of this prejudice. And when we dilute that, we're doing a profound disservice to the need for the term in the first place. It was created in order to help us understand something that we might hope would never happen again. So when people want to treat it like it's happening all the time, like sure, there's all kinds of micro phenomena of people blowing up synagogues or people being genuinely anti-Semitic. But if we kind of blow it out of proportion, like you were saying, Aaron, regarding the media, it just totally loses all of its meaning and its importance and its historical specificity.
I guess I'm just trying to determine what the future looks like. What will because like, dialogue and vocabulary is so powerful, but it's being manipulated. I wouldn't even say it's being manipulated. It's just being used because of the internet to get more views, to get more clicks, to sell more ads. How what it's going to go into books. Like books are going to lose a lot of substance, like the future of books. I guess AI are writing a lot of books now as well, which also has the impact. What's the future for dialogue? Like, what would you say the future of dialogue is? Where's this headed? Because I know that's an impossible question to answer as well.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Once again, I try to fetter my speculative abilities so that I don't kind of uh, uh, go into conspiratorial mode. Maybe it's just idealistic, but I have hope. Um, People can only change so fast. And to an extent, that can be a good thing that kind of makes sure, for example, the media wants to act like we can change on a day-to-day basis, but we can't fundamentally change our identity on a day-to-day basis. We just can't do that. So I have hope that even as terms evolve increasingly quickly and culture evolves. I mean, trends happen trends really come out of a day-to-day basis. It's been fascinating to me thinking about like trends used to be yearly things, like it was the whip and the nay nay for a whole year. And now it's like a new TikTok dance every day. It's like, okay, all that stuff can happen. All of those little minute changes can happen. But the really fundamental changes are cemented in history. And I think as long as we continue to keep alive the historical understanding of those terms, we have the ability to combat that sort of just open the floodgates and terms change on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, and then you can become more accepting of what's happening around you. As long that's like built like what's happened through history is like the core foundations of how we have lived to the like as long as we have, and how we've advanced the way we have. So if we keep them core beliefs and them core ways of thinking within us, that's like the foundations to living obviously a good, healthy, and prosperous life because we have done all these years. Yeah, that's a really good way of looking at it. Shall we wrap this one up here, guys?
That was really good. Cheers, Gavin.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for having me and engaging.
Yeah, no, you've been great. You've definitely taught me shed load, and
you've made me something that I probably not really. Something I've never really sat down and thought about is the power of words, and I think you've sort of drilled that into me today of how important words actually are. So whenever I'll read anything now or I'll listen to anything, I will listen to those, like especially the buzzwords that people use, because like we've mentioned racism and Semitism, just the use so much today, and how are they being used correctly, or are they just being used to sell papers or get clicks? And yeah, it's been great. Cheers, Gavin.
Well, thank y'all so much. Yeah, good luck on y'all's podcast. It's great, by the way.
Oh, thank you very much. Good luck with everything you're doing. I'm sure you're really young, and I think you're going to go a very, very long way. So we'd love to have you back on in the future just to check in on your journey and give us all the new wisdom that you've learned on the way.
For sure, I'd be happy.
All right, great. Thanks a lot, Gavin.
Cheers.
See ya. Bye.